Greetings. My name is Christina Theodoraki. I'm editor of Small Business Economics and Entrepreneurship Journal, and I have the great honor to interview today Martin Kenney, who is distinguished professor in Department of Human Ecology, Community and Regional Development Program at the University of California in Davis, and also co-director of the Berkeley Roundtable in the International Economy at the University of California. Martin is one of the most important entrepreneurship thought leaders and has contributed a lot on the rise of the platform economy, industrial clusters, and regional growth in some of the most important economies in the world, including also Silicon Valley. I'm very delighted also to conduct today this interview with Martin, because I remember I have conducted a first interview with Martin back in 2015. And today this is the opportunity to follow up this discussion and see how this field has evolved. Welcome, Martin, and thank you very much for participating to this interview series and sharing your knowledge with us today.
Thank you, Christina. It's a real pleasure to be able to meet with you, though remotely, unfortunately.
So Martin has published a very recent paper in Small Business Economics Journal on entrepreneurial ecosystems and industry knowledge. Does the winning region take all? This article has been published in September 2022, and it's already having a very big impact, and it's also very interesting to me and to our audience today. This paper has been co-authored with Yating Li from Nanjing Audit University in China, Donald Patton from University in California in Davis, and Abraham Song from Pepperdine University in Los Angeles. So Martin is going to give us more insight also from this article, but beyond on this article, I would like to ask Martin some questions about his research topic and how they emerge over time. So starting my first question, I would like to ask you how the rise of platform economy, the industrial clusters and regional growth, how did this topic started? How did your research journey started? And how you started to reflect on these topics and how this research evolved over time?
Well, thank you, Christina. Unfortunately, when I discuss all of this, I also have to give away my age. So I actually started my PhD dissertation was on the creation of the biotechnology industry, which was the commercialization by small firms funded by venture capitalists of what was then called recombinant DNA, right? And in the process of studying that, I became very interested in the role of venture capitalists in catalyzing U.S. entrepreneurial-driven economic growth. And I started working with Richard Florida, who some of you may know, who is a professor now at Toronto University, on the venture capital industry in 1984, well, actually 83. And we did interviews with venture capitalists in Ohio, and then through the intercession of a couple very prominent venture capitalists, Rich and I did a series of interviews in Silicon Valley, Boston, New York, on the with venture capitalists and firms and entrepreneurs that they had funded. And from that process, I became very interested in venture capital and therefore high technology entrepreneurship. We could call it Schumpeterian entrepreneurship. And from there, eventually I moved to California and I continued to study the venture capitalists, because what I found is that the American venture capital, the US venture capital industry, seemed to discover the new technologies, some of the new technologies that would be transformative. And that, of course, was particularly the digital technologies, but also the biomedical technologies, which is where U.S. venture capital has concentrated its investment. It is invested in other things, but generally those areas. Now, I recognize that, entrepreneurship is much broader than venture capital. Than what venture capitalists fund. And, that's been made very clear by Dave Aldrich, Zoltan, Dave Aldrich, many people's research. But I have sort of continued to focus on the venture capitalists. By focusing on the venture capitalists, I was able to follow new technology trends. And that got me to understand the implications of the internet, which is the small business economics article that we wrote, which is about the geography of internet startups and the rise of the platforms, the platform firms, all of which were funded by venture capital, with the exception perhaps of Microsoft. Microsoft was funded, but it's an earlier generation. So that then took me into considering what were the implications of platforms for entrepreneurship more generally. So that's sort of a broad overview of my career, which has been in many respects following what the venture capitalists are doing, and then the implications of the technologies that they're funding for the rest of society. So perhaps with that, I could talk about the small business economics paper that we collectively wrote.
Definitely.
Good. Okay. So what the entrepreneurial ecosystem literature and idea has become tremendously influential, and the leaders, including Dave and Eric Stamm and Ben Spiegel and all of those people have been writing about entrepreneurial ecosystems. Much of the research has been either qualitative, and some of the most recent research has been quantitative, but it's normally based on patent data, and it's not very chronological. And it doesn't look at the unfolding of an industry and how the entrepreneurial ecosystem and an industry interact, an industry-based knowledge, right? Because the cluster literature, the old cluster literature, which also had an ecosystem component to it, tended to look at entrepreneurship and knowledge together, right? And most of that literature did not look at outside forces, outside investors, outside knowledge coming in. There were a few exceptions. Peter Maskell wrote a great article a number of years ago about this. And so as we looked at the entrepreneurial ecosystem literature, which has become now really almost a dominant literature, what we thought is, let's try to see what needs to be local or regional and what can be sourced from the outside, because the entrepreneurial ecosystem literature has always had this tension between the local and entrepreneurs that often access resources from outside the region. And so is the entrepreneurial ecosystem, should we think about it as local, or should we think about it as something more like a virtual? So yes, you access resources and entrepreneurs, you're building your firm locally, but you may also reach out and access them. So we decided that given we had a database of all internet startups that went public from the beginning of the internet industry, sort of 1994, Yahoo, you may remember some of these firms now, many of them are gone, Excite, Spyglass, anyway. So we had all these firms. And what we decided to do is we decided to look at, well, where were they located? And then because of our database, we were able to locate all of the board of directors, all of the venture capitalists on the board, right? So we could look at all these entrepreneurial, we could look at the law firm because we had addresses for the lawyer that advised the firm. Now, it was a snapshot in time at the point of an IPO. So there's some drawbacks here. But what we were able to do is then take this whole history of the internet through 2020 and look every year at what was the location of the venture capitalists on the board, the other directors on the board, independent members, the law firms, and the investment bankers. And it's a descriptive paper. We eventually tested hypotheses, but it was a little bit more of a discovery paper, because very few people had actually thought that through and thought, how does that change as an industry starts to develop industry-specific knowledge? And what we found is that if you look at we looked at the firm, then we also looked at the venture capital data on every internet startup. Where were they located, right? And what we found is the internet was an interesting industry, and we need to test this on other industries. We're now working on the biotechnology industry, which may look different. Is we found that the startups, that would be the venture capital finance startups, did concentrate into Silicon Valley over time, but at a relatively slow rate. The firms that did an IPO, those would be the most successful firms, concentrated also over, we're talking from 1995 to 2020. So we've got the industry history, really. And what we found is that the IPOs also over time concentrated slightly in Silicon Valley. The law firms concentrated a little bit in Silicon Valley, but the literature on entrepreneurship says the lawyer is usually the closest, let's say, entrepreneurial supporter of a firm. Your lawyer is your counselor, right? We have, in English, we have two words. We have your lawyer, and we also call them counselor. Avocat, maybe in French, I think you would probably use advocate, avocat, right? Counselor means I'm talking to you, I'm counseling you. So what we found is there was some more concentration of the lawyers in Silicon Valley than the firms, but not much, because that relationship was so close. But what we found was that the venture capitalists, the board of directors, the investment bankers, concentrated much more heavily in Silicon Valley over time than even the firms did. So our point was that the entrepreneurial ecosystem, entrepreneurial services can be general. I'm a venture capitalist. I'm a lawyer. I'm an investment banker. I'm an auditor. We couldn't find auditors. That's a general service to all entrepreneurs. However, what our argument is that as an industry knowledge cluster grew, Silicon Valley becomes the center of the internet industry, you get entrepreneurial ecosystem actors that have industry knowledge, and they are competing against entrepreneurial actors outside of the region that don't have industry knowledge. And as an entrepreneur, industry knowledge, which wasn't available at the beginning because it was scattered. Silicon Valley had more electronics, but it wasn't an internet center of knowledge. I mean, it was one, but there are many others. CERN in Switzerland develops the hypertext markup protocols, et cetera. The University of Illinois develops the first browser. So the knowledge is scattered, the industry knowledge. So then there's no real reason for you take the entrepreneurial ecosystem actor close to you, because there's nothing, everybody's got the same knowledge. But over time, as that knowledge concentrates in Silicon Valley, the entrepreneurial ecosystem actors concentrate even more in that knowledge cluster. And then entrepreneurs outside the region go not to their local entrepreneurial ecosystem actor that doesn't have industry knowledge, but they go to the entrepreneurial ecosystem actor somewhere else, because that person has the industry knowledge plus the entrepreneurial ecosystem knowledge. So that's sort of the main discovery, which from a policy perspective gets kind of interesting. Because from a policy perspective, ideally, you would like to keep everything local. But on the other hand, you want your firm to be successful, right? Because success is better than failure, basically, right? And so as a local policymaker, you may want to help your firms develop those linkages to the industry knowledge cluster, particularly if your entrepreneurial ecosystem is generating all kinds of firms in all different entrepreneurial areas. There's going to be no industry knowledge synergy locally. So that it may be better for the success of the firm to reach out to some other region where that knowledge is clustered and the entrepreneurial ecosystem actors are. So that, I think, is the main takeaway. And some entrepreneurial ecosystem policymakers are doing this, but others might say, no, we shouldn't do this because we want to keep everything local. And our argument would be that may be a mistake. So that's the general gist of the article.
Excellent. And this is what I like also in our discussions, is that I have established questions, but I found so inspiring how you express the focus of the paper. I want to ask you other questions. So my question would be or ecosystem actors. Did this role change over the years? And do you see, for example, there was a lot of theories saying that venture capital is the main actor of the ecosystem, and also reflected to the governance aspect of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. We had a special issue in small business economics trying to understand the governments. Should it be top down or bottom up? And there's a lot of reflection saying that we need funding or we need venture capital, and if we have that, this survives. So based on what you see, does this role change, or do more and more focus locally venture capitals? And what are your suggestions on that?
Well, so I think there's sort of a number of issues. And if one looks at the long history of venture capital, and I've looked at it basically since its beginning. I'm not that old, but I've studied the history. It began in 1950, and I was not studying venture capital in 1950. I was a baby. So one of the things we see is that over time, venture capital grows and declines. We're in a bubble now, so there's venture capital in more and more regions of the world and of the country, where the bubble is going to burst and that's going to shrink again. It's happened 4 or 5 times in my own lifetime. Local venture capital can be very important, and there's certainly nothing wrong with it. To expect local venture capital to create an entrepreneurial ecosystem, I think is too much. And I think Marianne Feldman, a friend of ours, has written a paper and Richard Florida even wrote a paper even much longer, Richard Florida and I, which said that, venture capital doesn't create entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs create venture capital. So if you have the entrepreneurs in the region that are successful, venture capital will come, right? And if there's enough of that entrepreneurial ecosystems generating good deals, venture capital will then become local. So that's a general pattern. So you can create as much venture capital as you want in city X, but if city X has no entrepreneurs, the venture capital will invest somewhere else. So in Ohio, there's some venture capitalists, but all the big venture capitalists in the 1970s and 80s in Ohio and places like that, they all moved to California. They all moved to Silicon Valley because that's where the entrepreneurs were. I remember a long time ago, a very famous venture capital, Donald Valentine, Rich Flora, and I were interviewing him and said, well, why did you set up? He started in LA. Why did you, move and set up and build your firm? Sequoia's the firm, one of the most successful venture capital firms of all time. And he said, well, why would you put a gold mining house somewhere where there's no gold? It makes no sense. So in that sense, we're, as a policy, from a policy perspective, it's to find the entrepreneurs, hopefully keep them local. You don't want the entrepreneurs to move to Silicon Valley. You don't care if the entrepreneur gets venture capital from Silicon Valley. That's okay. But you don't want the entrepreneur to move. So if you can create an environment where you get successful entrepreneurship, and maybe you add some venture capital into the mix, that's fine. I would be more concerned and interested in actually the lawyers. I think the lawyers are really key. You want to have law firms locally that can advise your firms on how to do a startup correctly, right? Because if you do a startup incorrectly, it's hard as it grows to manage it. So I think those are the kinds of things you might consider. You might also consider, do you have ways of recruiting top tier executives to the region? To build a firm, you're going to need good management, because usually often, not always, but often the entrepreneurs are not good managers. So you may need to create an environment where those folks are available. So
my question related to that is reflecting the boundaries. You're starting to saying, is it close the boundaries? For example, the entrepreneurial ecosystem discussion has been in the early beginning trying to settle the local boundaries, and this raised a lot of questions related to what is the difference between an entrepreneurial ecosystem and a cluster? So you have this local proximity. So my first question would be, what are for you the differences between a cluster and an entrepreneurial ecosystem? And the second is related to these boundaries. Should you focus on closed boundaries, or because you were saying related to maintaining this industrial knowledge that may bring growth and regional growth locally? Or should you encourage open boundaries? You can go out and can bring and multiply probably this knowledge. How do you see these two questions? The first, do entrepreneurial ecosystem and clusters are the same or not? And should boundaries be close or more open?
So I think the cluster entrepreneurial ecosystem discussion, as I understand it today, I think most people would believe that an entrepreneurial ecosystem need not be totally local. And I think that has to be correct. And in that way, in many respects, it's different from a cluster, because a cluster is about industrial knowledge. An entrepreneurial ecosystem is about knowledge of how to build entrepreneurial firms, right, in the region. And our argument is that at the beginning of an industry, you can make a play to become the center of the industry. But after the industry has become kind of settled, you can still have entrepreneurial firms in that industry, but the support organizations may no longer, some of them may no longer be local, and that's okay. Because those non-local entrepreneurial parts of what you would call the entrepreneurial ecosystem come in from outside, but if they bring with them industry knowledge that you don't have because you're not the main cluster, that's okay. So it may depend also on where you are in the life cycle of the industry itself, right? Once today, Silicon Valley is the center of the internet industry. That doesn't mean you can't create a successful internet company somewhere else, but it means the industrial knowledge that's necessary to have a really great venture capitalist is not someone who's just a great venture capitalist, but it's someone who knows that industry, knows positioning in the industry, knows where you can get management, et cetera, for that industry, right? Because that's what you need. At the beginning, nobody knows. This is Steve Klepper. At the beginning, nobody knows anything. People are coming in from all sorts of other industries. But once that industry knowledge gets going, then you need advisors that not only are good entrepreneurship advisors, general, but also are specific. They know that industry. Otherwise, your firm will be malpositioned, and malpositioned firms, they die because they're not positioned well. Right? It's kind of a circular argument. So that's sort of the argument. And it's kind of built on Steve Klepper's work, but he doesn't look so much at the entrepreneurial ecosystem. He's looking at the cluster and the firms and the industry. And he says, the cluster grows, blah, 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 blah. Now, that doesn't mean you can't start a successful firm. As Pino Audio and Olaf Sorensen on the shoemaking, they did a paper on the shoemaking industry and where was it located. And you could still have a successful firm not located in the cluster. But we would argue that if you then looked at who were the funders for that firm, who were the investment bankers, who were the other kind of entrepreneurial ecosystem actor, they might have come from the cluster. Though the firm was located not in the cluster, became successful, the entrepreneurial ecosystem actors that helped the firm came from the cluster because they had the industry knowledge. And this firm, if it would have taken all local entrepreneurial ecosystem people who assist entrepreneurial firms, they wouldn't have been able to help it as much because they were missing the industry knowledge. So that's the argument. The argument is you've got this stuff called industry knowledge, and that grows in a cluster. And you have entrepreneurial ecosystems that can be in different places that don't have to be just regional, local. They also, and the literature is showing this, they also can extend outside and be part of, we could call it the entrepreneurial ecosystem, but it's not purely spatial. And that's, I think, our contribution, is we show this sort of industries, Klepper type of knowledge, an entrepreneurial ecosystem, entrepreneurial building knowledge, which can be general. And at different times in an industry's life, the location of this knowledge may be different. So early, it can be scattered about because there is no real concentration. Over time, it starts to build here, industry knowledge, entrepreneurial knowledge, and this becomes so powerful that the entrepreneurs over here need to access that knowledge. And that's purely the argument. It's a very simple argument, but I think it adds to both of those literatures.
It's incredible. I highly appreciate it, like a so clear description. And also, it's very important you're saying about the life cycle. And what is important also is that we see that industry sometimes can challenge their evolution, because we have to situate where is the in which life cycle you are in the industry, then the life cycle of the cluster or the region you are in when entrepreneurs come. And I think industries evolve over time and faces different challenges. And you, in the beginning, you start to create this knowledge between you, and then you have these changes, these shocks. And I think that entrepreneurs also come and bring some shocks to the industry. And this important is to have this agility and resilience within your ecosystem to bring more value. And I think this is important to also make awareness of the industries that they are evolved within an ecosystem, and it's important also to co-create this value. And I would like to ask, what do you think the main challenges will be in the future on these topics? What we will trying to more see and explore, we want to explore, and what will be your advices for researchers that want to engage in these topics?
So I'm being a kind of a Schumpeterian, right? I'm a sort of old school, and yeah, I particularly like historical evolutions of clusters or entrepreneurial ecosystems. I mean, obviously theoretically informed, you know, and I think of some of Ron Boschma's or Cohen Franken's economic geographers contributions there. So I think that's a very, very important area. I think the area that, and I know Zoltan and David have been writing on this, is how does this change in an increasingly digitalized world? What changes, what doesn't? I mean, you know, Silicon Valley is still a big powerhouse, right? So in a highly digitalized world. So, but I think that's the question. Other questions one could ask that haven't been asked is, when do entrepreneurial ecosystems not take off? So you get a very successful company like Qualcomm in San Diego. There's very little other digital firms in San Diego. It never did. It's very successful, but that entrepreneurial ecosystem it did very well in biotech, but it never took off and created startups and spin-offs and developed a much larger cluster. I mean, even, you know, in North Carolina has been very successful, but you had SAS, right? Very successful digital software database company. But it never led to much more in North Carolina. North Carolina has been very entrepreneurial, but not in that area. So why did then so there'll be questions of why did an entrepreneurial ecosystem, North Carolina, everybody agrees has one, not lead in this particular case to something else? Now, you know, proving the negative is always tough. So researchers should be very careful not to, you know, try to do that. But I think the evolution of ecosystems, when does an ecosystem become more powerful than just local? I think is could be interesting, and there probably are some quantitative ways of thinking about this using perhaps patent data or business data, entrepreneur business data. I mean, Mercedes Delgado has looked at supplier chains, and perhaps that database that she has, I should tell her this, but databases like that could be used. The Europeans, you have pretty good data on firm formation. And so one could think about when do these catalyze into something. So those might be directions for further research that journals like I can't speak for small business economics, but RP or small business economics might be interested in, or economic geography.
Thank you very much, Martin. We're reaching the end of this session. For me, it was every interview with you is like a privilege, a very privileged moment to spend with an important and impactful entrepreneurship thought leader, and we can say a giant that helped build the reflection and advance this research journey. So for me, I would like to thank you very, very much. It was extremely interesting for me, and I'm sure for our audience too. So I encourage also to download this paper from the Springer's website. I don't know if you have any last comment to add?
Well, the final thing is that I spoke about digital, and I think we need to think about even more what will the geography of entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial ecosystems be in a platform, in an increasingly platform based world, where you could have things like crowdfunding, which could come from anywhere in the world to help an entrepreneurial firm get started. So I think that's the other direction that I think the research surely has to go, because it's so important.
So the paper is also for more reading, and for our audience, they can freely download from the Springer's website. And we'll look forward to hear more on this paper and how it advanced. Thank you again for sharing with us all your insights.
Have a great rest of your day. Thank you. Bye-bye.